Hello, family. Enjoy this relaxing moment with Surly Tales. Remember to hit the like button, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. It means the world to us. Also, share this video with your friends and loved ones, and turn on post notifications so you don't miss future videos from us. Thank you as you do so. Sit back and relax as we dive into the story. Ebony City was a place of relentless energy. Each morning, as the sun shimmered over the horizon, it cast golden rays across the sprawling metropolis, illuminating towering skyscrapers and neon billboards that offered a sense of modern Africa in all its bright possibilities. The roads bustled with people heading to work, school, or business endeavors, each person moving to a distinct rhythm but weaving together into the city's grand tapestry. Despite the city's continuous activity, there remained corners of deep struggle, where poverty's shadow fell heavily. Street vendors hawked roasted groundnuts, fresh fruits, and zesty suya. Hawkers threaded their way through lines of cars, trying to make a living any way possible. In Ebony City, wealth and hardship lived side by side, separated often by only a few blocks, or sometimes by the glass walls of luxury businesses that towered over makeshift kiosks and street stalls. Nestled in one of the city's most prosperous districts stood Ebony Mall, a gleaming symbol of progress and prosperity. Built with modern designs that blended African architectural motifs, like the intricate geometric patterns inspired by traditional fabrics, Ebony Mall was every shopper's dream. Storefronts boasted international brand logos and displays of the latest fashions. The overhead speakers played Afrobeats that reverberated through polished floors, each beat echoing excitement. Air-conditioned corridors offered a sanctuary from the city's heat, enticing people to linger within its bright halls. Families came to Ebony Mall to enjoy the cinema, newlyweds to shop for furniture, and young professionals to grab quick lunches at the food court that served everything from jollof rice to shawarma. It was a universe of its own, designed to celebrate modern African luxury yet open its doors to anyone who could pay the price of entry. Among the many employees who kept Ebony Mall running smoothly was a janitress named Nandi. She was petite, often sporting a neatly tied headscarf and a warm smile that could brighten even the drabbest Monday. While other employees dashed around the mall trying to impress superiors or secure promotions, Nandi was content to do her duty quietly. She was in her late 20s, though her eyes carried a gentleness that spoke of deeper wisdom and a heart conditioned to compassion. Every day she arrived before sunrise, wielding a mop and a bucket, determined to keep the hallways immaculate for the early wave of shoppers. Her coworkers admired her diligence and found comfort in her kindness, even though she rarely spoke about herself. There was something disarmingly humble about Nandi that made people gravitate toward her presence. From a distance, one might assume Nandi was an average maintenance worker, overshadowed by the prestigious aura of Ebony Mall. But those who interacted with her noticed her unwavering sense of pride in her work. She never gossiped or complained about the role. Instead, she took to her tasks with an almost reverential dedication, ensuring that every smear on a glass door or dirt tracked onto the glossy floor was swiftly handled. She seemed to watch everything with a discerning gaze that belied a deeper understanding of the mall and its daily operations, an understanding that went beyond that of a typical janitress. She saw how the high-paying customers strolled in wearing bespoke suits and designer gowns, how hawkers outside were shooed away by security, how the new generation of tech-savvy Africans found it easier to carry out transactions through mobile payments. Nandi took note of it all, her quiet presence absorbing every detail. Yet, beyond the bright interior and the well-polished walkways, the outskirts of Ebony Mall reflected a different face of the city. Under the shade of a half-wilting flamboyant tree by the main entrance, one could often spot an elderly woman huddled on the pavement. Her frail figure, wrapped in faded Ankara cloth, seemed almost invisible to the polished patrons stepping in and out. This elderly woman was Mama Imani, a beggar who had seen better days. People hurried by, some shooting quick glances but most ignoring her entirely. She would quietly stretch out a trembling hand, hoping for a few naira or cedis, depending on the local currency, and whisper blessings upon anyone kind enough to acknowledge her presence. But day after day, she remained largely overlooked, a speck in the shadows of Ebony Mall's grandeur. Nandi, however, had not missed Mama Imani's soft presence. While others dismissed her, Nandi found herself drawn to the older woman's gentle spirit. Over time, she would occasionally step outside the mall's pristine doors to offer Mama Imani a bottle of water, or even a simple takeaway meal from the mall's cafeteria. The older woman's face would light up with gratitude. Though they never engaged in lengthy conversations, their few interactions reflected a bond forged by mutual kindness. Nandi would listen quietly as Mama Imani murmured her thanks and blessings, her voice quivering with age. And Nandi, always gentle, would respond with a small smile and a respectful nod before returning to her duties. Yet not everyone appreciated such acts of kindness. Mr. Dube, the mall's flamboyant manager, held a particularly stern stance on loiterers around his premises. Tall, impeccably dressed in sharp suits, and keen on presentations, Mr. Dube thrived on Ebony Mall's success. Each day, he strutted through the corridors, politely greeting high-profile customers while barely sparing a second glance for anyone he considered below his standards. In private, he insisted on a strict policy of discouraging beggars and street vendors near the mall, believing that they tarnished its sophisticated image. So, whenever Mr. Dube spotted Mama Imani at the entrance, he would become visibly agitated. On multiple occasions, security guards had forcibly removed the elderly woman at his instruction, hoping she would find another spot to beg. But as if drawn by fate or necessity, she always found her way back. Mr. Dube had noticed Nandi's warmth toward Mama Imani a few times, but since Nandi performed her job effectively and did not create dramatic disruptions, he tolerated her actions, albeit grudgingly. He reasoned that giving a beggar a bottle of water every now and then was not worth the hassle, but any further offenses would be closely watched. It was clear from the disapproving glances he gave Nandi that his patience was wearing thin. After all, Mr. Dube prided himself in maintaining Ebony Mall's luxurious reputation, and nothing, especially not a lowly janitress, should risk undermining his vision. As days turned into weeks, however, Ebony City's unrelenting sun brought harsher conditions for those living on the edge. Mama Imani's health seemed to waver. Nandi observed her coughing and noticed her hunched posture whenever she ventured out to offer her small tokens of compassion. With each passing day, the old woman's plight weighed more heavily on Nandi's heart. Despite the unspoken tension, she continued her small acts of kindness, unaware that her compassion would eventually become the catalyst for an unexpected confrontation and a shocking revelation that would leave Ebony Mall's staff and patrons reeling. The stage was set for a twist of fate that no one, not even Nandi herself, saw coming. In a city where wealth often spoke loudest and poverty lurked in the background, the true measure of humanity was about to be tested. The quiet janitress, who every day mopped floors and kept the mall spotless, was set to upend the social hierarchy and redefine what it truly meant to be powerful in Ebony City. What she didn't know was that her own secret was also on the brink of exposure, an astonishing truth that would unravel with surprising intensity when generosity clashed with strict rules. Tension simmered beneath the glossy exterior of Ebony Mall. Mr. Dube, with his penchant for order and image, had long suspected that one of his staff was clandestinely assisting the frail beggar outside the main entrance. Though he had turned a blind eye initially, he now bristled with frustration each time he caught a fleeting glimpse of charitable acts occurring on the steps of his domain. Daily reports of a rise in beggars congregating around the mall seemed to compound his irritation. He was convinced that the presence of any beggars, especially an elderly woman, gave the mall a slum-like feel that contrasted with the high standards he had set. More than once, he had threatened to increase surveillance around the entrances, hoping to catch the culprit in the act. Nandi, on the other hand, carried on with her daily responsibilities, blissfully unaware of just how closely Mr. Dube had begun to monitor her moves. She would clock in punctually before the crowds arrived, her mop and bucket in tow, gliding silently through the hallways to ensure every polished surface remained immaculate. By noon, she might slip away for a brief moment, carefully placing a takeout meal in a brown paper bag. She never lingered outside for too long, in part because she did not wish to raise suspicion, but mostly because her lunch break was limited. A quick hello, a warm smile, and a soft inquiry into Mama Imani's health were all the elderly woman received, yet these tiny gestures of humanity were enough to keep a flicker of hope alive in her eyes. It was during one such clandestine act of kindness that Mr. Dube finally seized his opportunity. The manager's schedule that day had been unusually open, allowing him to leave his office for an unplanned patrol around the mall. He had made his way down the escalator, pausing briefly to inspect the cleanliness of the marble floor, reflective enough that he could adjust his tie in its polished sheen. Determined to showcase impeccable leadership, he called out instructions to a passing maintenance worker about rearranging flower pots near the entryway. Suddenly, he noticed Nandi making her usual discreet exit through a side door. Sensing an impending confrontation, he followed her quietly until he stood behind the tinted glass. From there, he had a clear view of Nandi handing a small packet of food to Mama Imani, who bowed her head in grateful thanks. The sight enraged Mr. Dube more than he would have predicted. Something about Nandi's calm act of generosity rubbed him the wrong way, as though it were a direct affront to his authority. He felt that the image of a beggar receiving charity at the very doorstep of Ebony Mall undermined everything he had worked for: his pristine environment, the aura of luxury, his own position as the manager of one of the city's most prestigious commercial hubs. As the midday sun cast a bright glow on the scene, highlighting the wrinkles on Mama Imani's face and the quiet concern on Nandi's, Mr. Dube decided he had seen enough. Storming out of his hiding place, he flung the mall's glass door open with such force that it rattled. Nandi spun around, startled, dropping the half-open paper bag in her haste to stand up. A few grains of rice spilled onto the tiled pavement, scattering across the glossy surface like seeds. Mr. Dube's expression was thunderous, his jaw clenched, eyes narrowed with the cold intensity of suppressed rage. "What do you think you're doing?" he hissed, casting a murderous glance in Mama Imani's direction, who shrunk back reflexively. "Was just," Nandi began, her voice quivering with surprise. Despite her best efforts, she found herself fumbling for words. Deep inside, she knew she had done nothing wrong, but Mr. Dube's overwhelming presence and the knowledge of his authority triggered a wave of anxiety. She had never had a direct confrontation with him, and it showed in her trembling hands. "I told all staff, explicitly, that no one, especially no employee of this mall, is allowed to encourage beggars around our premises." Mr. Dube's voice reverberated, drawing the attention of passers-by. A few security guards standing at the entrance exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to intervene. Shoppers slowed their pace, sensing a drama unfolding. Nandi felt a rush of conflicting emotions: fear for her job, concern for Mama Imani's well-being, and an underlying resolve that told her she could not simply apologize and walk away. But she was still the janitress, the humble worker with no illusions about the power hierarchy in Ebony Mall. Softly, with a respectful but firm tone, she said, "Sir, this woman is old and she's hungry. I wasn't doing any harm, only showing a bit of compassion." Mr. Dube nearly scoffed at that. "Compassion has its place, but not here. Not on my watch. You are paid to clean the floors, not to play philanthropist outside the mall. Do you have any idea how this affects our image?" His scowl deepened, and his voice rose in volume. A few onlookers, witnessing Nandi's trembling stance, began to shift uncomfortably. Although Mr. Dube had a reputation as a strict manager, no one expected such an explosion of anger over a small act of kindness. Murmurs rippled among the small crowd forming near the entrance, some clucking their tongues in disapproval. Nandi lowered her gaze momentarily, her heart pounding in her chest. "I'm sorry, sir, but it felt wrong to ignore her suffering. I see her every day and—" Mr. Dube silenced her with a raised hand. "Enough. You have violated my direct instructions. If it's so wrong, then maybe you're not suited to work here at Ebony Mall." He paused for effect, letting the severity of his words sink in. In a swift motion that seemed all too final, he jabbed a finger at her chest. "Gather your things. You're done. I do not want to see you in this uniform tomorrow. Do you understand me?" A hush fell over the entrance as the magnitude of the moment sank in. The security guards stood rigid, uncertain whether they should attempt to de-escalate the situation. Nandi's face turned pale, her lips parting in disbelief. The word "fired" had not been explicitly spoken, but there was little doubt about Mr. Dube's intention. After all the hours she had spent scrubbing floors, polishing handrails, and ensuring Ebony Mall shone bright every morning, it seemed her dedication mattered little in the wake of one perceived transgression. Mama Imani, still kneeling on the ground, stared at Nandi with wide, worried eyes. She reached out a trembling hand toward Nandi's ankle, as if to offer sympathy or hold her back from the storm brewing above them. The old woman's voice was a fragile whisper, barely audible over Mr. Dube's fury. "Child, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to get you in trouble," she murmured, tears slipping from her eyes. Nandi glanced at Mama Imani, her heart overwhelmed with empathy and guilt. Then she looked at Mr. Dube, who stood tall and unrelenting in his anger. She realized she was cornered by forces beyond her immediate control. Still, she felt a twinge of unspoken confidence, a hidden truth lodged deep inside her that she had carefully guarded. She could feel the weight of it stirring, though now was clearly not the time to reveal it. Her voice shook, but her resolve was clear. "Yes, Mr. Dube. I understand," she said at last. Without another word, she bent down to pick up the paper bag, now soiled and scattered. She spared one last glance at the trembling figure of Mama Imani before heading inside to retrieve her personal belongings. Those who witnessed the incident couldn't help but feel a mix of shock and pity for Nandi. Some shook their heads at the manager's harshness, while others quickly resumed their shopping, not wanting to get tangled in a confrontation. Security guards parted to let Nandi pass, their eyes lingering on her bowed head, unsure of how to offer any comfort. Mr. Dube remained at the entrance a moment longer, making a show of rolling his shoulders back as though shaking off the tension of the encounter. Then he, too, returned to his office, certain he had made an example of the insubordinate janitress. The next morning brought the usual clamor of Ebony City, vendors yelling out the day's prices for tomatoes and peppers, commuter buses honking incessantly, and pedestrians shuffling off to their workplaces. Ebony Mall glistened beneath the fresh sunlight, unperturbed by the drama of the previous day. For the patrons arriving to browse high-end boutique shops or grab a latte from the stylish coffee stand inside, it was just another day in the city's most luxurious retail center. Inside the mall, however, a subtle air of unease settled over the staff. Gossip had spread quickly about Mr. Dube's outburst and Nandi's abrupt dismissal. Custodians huddled in corners, discussing the injustice of firing someone for helping an old woman. Some sales clerks whispered about the coldness of Mr. Dube's heart, worried that such a punitive reaction might foreshadow how little job security they truly had. A new wave of caution gripped them all. If Nandi, a model of dedication, could be fired over a small benevolent act, who among them could truly feel safe? Yet, despite the whispering and side eyes, Ebony Mall continued its usual operations as if nothing had happened. Mr. Dube made his rounds with a renewed sense of authority, ensuring no one dared to question his decisions. He instructed security to enforce stricter protocols around the premises. Woe to any beggar who might loiter near the entrances, for they would be quickly removed. If any employee thought to demonstrate acts of charity within sight of customers, they kept such impulses well hidden. Fearful compliance now reigned in the halls. A few staff members bravely approached Mr. Dube's office to inquire about Nandi, couching their concern in business terms. They reasoned that she was one of their most reliable cleaners, always punctual, never missing a day of work, and that losing her might cause the custodial team to fall behind schedule. But Mr. Dube brushed off their concerns. He was quick to remind them that Ebony Mall had no shortage of eager job applicants ready to fill any vacancy. Replacements, in his eyes, were much easier to find than discipline. Besides, the manager had a personal standard to uphold, one that transcended the affection of subordinates. He assured them that a new janitor would be hired within the week. Meanwhile, in a modest apartment on the city's outskirts, Nandi awakened at dawn out of habit, only to remember she no longer needed to prepare for her shift. The realization settled on her heart like a heavy stone. She made herself a cup of tea, stirring the brew slowly as she mulled over the events of the previous day. Even though she felt the sting of unjust treatment, she also felt an odd sense of relief. Finally, she no longer had to hide in plain sight. For months, she had carried the burden of a secret that could shake the very foundations of Ebony Mall's power structure. She had observed, quietly and without protest, the daily routines, finances, and management operations of the mall that, unknown to most, she truly owned. Yes, she owned Ebony Mall. The revelation would have stunned every employee, from the new intern to Mr. Dube himself. But Nandi had her reasons for concealing her identity. Born into a wealthy family that had long dealt with real estate and retail investments, she was the beneficiary of an inheritance that included majority shares in several high-profile properties across the nation. Instead of publicly flaunting her ownership, Nandi had chosen to work incognito among the staff, believing that doing so would give her insight into how her properties were managed and how her employees were treated. Yet, the decision to keep her identity hidden had now resulted in her unceremonious dismissal. She was unsure whether to laugh at the irony or be incensed by Mr. Dube's arrogance. As she sat by her small kitchen window, sipping her tea, she replayed yesterday's scene in her mind, the fear in Mama Imani's eyes, the look of dismay on the faces of onlookers. She remembered her own surge of anger at the injustice, tempered only by her hidden knowledge. A plan formed in her mind, a vision of how she might use her real position to correct the wrongs she had witnessed. Midway through the morning, her phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a message from a contact she had saved under a pseudonym, Ao, her personal advisor and attorney. She had asked Ao to keep her business affairs separate from her daily life, ensuring no accidental disclosures. The text was brief but urgent. "We have an issue to discuss regarding Ebony Mall. Please call me at your earliest convenience." Nandi felt a swirl of both apprehension and anticipation. She suspected that news of her dismissal might have already reached Ao. Rising from her seat, she decided it was time to set her plan in motion. A short while later, Nandi found herself pacing in her living room, phone pressed to her ear as Ao spoke. "I heard about the altercation at the mall," Ao said, voice threaded with concern. "But I only got the details from another contact. Why didn't you inform me first?" Nandi exhaled slowly. "I was still reeling from it. I didn't want to act rashly. I needed a moment to think about the best course of action." On the other end of the line, Ao's tone shifted to something more businesslike. "Understood. But you can't let this slide. As the owner, you've just been fired by your own manager for an act of kindness. And you know that Ebony Mall's brand is built around the concept of community development and giving back. This manager's behavior goes against everything we stand for." Nandi nodded, even though Ao couldn't see her. "I'm aware. I intend to address it properly. But let's hold off on any immediate public statements. I'd like to gather more information first. Schedule a board meeting for the end of the week. And please, keep my identity under wraps until I decide otherwise." Ao hesitated. "That might be tricky. Rumors are already swirling among shareholders about changes in management. If the rumors start to get out of hand, we'll manage them. For now, just trust me." A quiet resolve filled Nandi's voice. "I need to see how Mr. Dube continues to run the mall in my absence. I want the truth to come out in a way that underscores the value of humanity over mere profit." With that, she ended the call, feeling the familiar adrenaline rush of stepping into her real role. She thought about Mama Imani, about the dignity she deserved and how Ebony Mall's policies could be reshaped to serve the community better. Up until now, she had tried to gather insight from the ground level. But it seemed fate had chosen this moment to push her hand. In the following days, Nandi quietly collected evidence of Mr. Dube's past actions. She already had access to board minutes, financial records, and staff turnover reports. Through some discreet phone calls, she learned about frequent complaints of mistreatment lodged by employees against Mr. Dube, complaints that had not gone beyond middle management. There were also concerns about how some of the mall's community outreach funds were dispersed, or more accurately, not dispersed at all. Though anger bubbled within her, Nandi reminded herself to remain cautious and strategic. She wanted to make sure that when she confronted Mr. Dube, the confrontation would be backed by evidence so undeniable that he could not talk his way out of it. Far from a simple matter of punishing him for firing her, this was about justice. It was about reinstating the values she believed Ebony Mall should embody, kindness, fairness, and genuine community support. As Ebony Mall's staff continued working under the watchful eye of Mr. Dube, they wondered what had become of Nandi. Some missed her friendly smile, while others told newly hired staff about the janitress who got fired for trying to do something good. The story lingered in the corridors, an echo of moral conflict reverberating through every corner of the grand shopping center. Meanwhile, Nandi prepared for her reappearance, a transformative return that would shake the mall to its core and restore hope to those who had been silenced for far too long. Ebony Mall was a hive of activity as the weekend approached. Shoppers flowed in like a steady current, eager to make purchases or simply revel in the mall's air-conditioned comfort. The cinemas advertised the latest blockbusters from Nollywood and Hollywood, while restaurants competed to serve the best jollof rice, chapati wraps, and international cuisines. The hum of commerce was thick in the air, drowning out quieter tensions that simmered behind the scenes. Within this bustling backdrop, Mr. Dube continued to run the mall with an iron fist, demonstrating a veneer of cordiality to high-paying customers but brusqueness toward his subordinates. Unbeknownst to him, changes were quietly taking shape in the upper echelons of Ebony Mall's ownership. The board of directors, alerted by Nandi's attorney and guided by her subtle influence, had called an emergency meeting. Despite Mr. Dube's position as the mall's manager, he reported to a corporate hierarchy, a hierarchy that, until recently, he had assumed was disinterested in day-to-day operations, so long as profit soared. His complacency made him oblivious to the stealthy maneuvers in the background. He did not anticipate a day of reckoning. Nandi, meanwhile, spent much of her time with her legal team, fine-tuning the evidence she'd gathered. There were signed testimonies from staff who had been maltreated, a log of petty infractions that had resulted in dismissals or forced resignations, and details of misappropriated funds that had never reached the mall's designated community outreach programs. She pored over financial statements, matching them against official ledgers, uncovering discrepancies that hinted at unethical conduct. Each discovery brought her closer to an unassailable case. Yet, as certain as she was of her moral high ground, she also felt a growing sense of responsibility. For all its glitz, Ebony Mall was still a vital pillar in the community. Any drastic action could disrupt the livelihood of thousands, from store owners to suppliers. She aimed to uproot corruption, not tear down the entire structure. Her nights were sleepless but filled with purpose. She recalled her original motivation for working incognito. She had wanted to understand how her inheritance operated on the ground. She had sought an authentic perspective on employees' daily realities. Over the months, she had grown intimately familiar with the fear and exhaustion that often plagued the lower rungs of the workforce. Now, with her own dismissal, she was doubly resolved that no one else should have to endure such injustice. But she knew that appending Mr. Dube's tyrannical management style would require careful planning. Emotion alone could not dictate her moves. When the day of the board meeting finally arrived, the conference room at Ebony Mall's executive suite was abuzz with low chatter. There were a dozen or so board members in attendance, each seated around a long, gleaming table made of local mahogany. The decor of the room mirrored the mall's blend of modern design and African craftsmanship. Glass walls met carved wood paneling in an elegant fusion. Typically, these meetings addressed financial forecasts, marketing strategies, and lease agreements for new tenants. However, the abrupt convening of this session suggested something more serious. The air was taut with a sense of impending confrontation. Mr. Dube took his seat at the table, visibly curious but confident. He had dressed in one of his finest suits, complete with cufflinks that sparkled under the overhead lights. His posture radiated self-assuredness, as though he believed he was merely about to justify the mall's impressive quarterly earnings. As the board chair, a woman named Mrs. Lawson, glanced around the room, she signaled for the meeting to begin. "We have some urgent matters to discuss regarding the management of Ebony Mall," she said, her voice calm but stern. Clearing her throat, Mrs. Lawson produced a folder thick with documents. "We've received multiple complaints from employees citing your managerial approach as harsh and at times unethical, Mr. Dube. These complaints involve allegations of wrongful termination, including that of one of our janitorial staff, as well as the possible misappropriation of community outreach funds. Mr. Dube's eyes flickered. A taut smile pulled at his lips, as though to diminish the gravity of the accusations. I assure you, these matters have been exaggerated. Ebony Mall remains profitable and well-regarded. Any staff issues are minor and have been handled appropriately. As for the outreach funds, I have no idea what these allegations refer to. Mrs. Lawson's gaze remained unyielding. We appreciate your perspective. However, we have someone here who can speak to these issues in more detail. With that, she nodded to an assistant standing by the door. The assistant stepped out momentarily, returning within seconds to announce the arrival of a special guest. In walked Nandi, dressed not in her janitorial uniform, but in a sleek, professional outfit. She carried herself with a composed air, exuding quiet confidence. The transformation was so striking that Mr. Dube failed to recognize her at first. But after a few seconds, he realized who stood before him. His eyes widened, confusion flooding his features. "What is this?" he asked, his voice suddenly shaky. Mrs. Lawson gestured toward Nandi. "Meet Miss Nandi. She's not simply a former janitress. She's the majority shareholder of Ebony Mall and has been conducting an internal review of our operations. She can clarify the full scope of these allegations and present her findings." Silence overtook the room. More than one board member who had never met Nandi in person gaped at her in surprise, hastily realizing they were in the presence of the mall's principal owner. Nandi's gaze settled on Mr. Dube, who remained frozen in place, struggling to piece together how this woman he had unceremoniously fired could hold such a lofty position. "Good afternoon," Nandi began, her voice steady. "I thank you all for convening this meeting on short notice. I've spent the last several months working incognito as a janitorial staff member within Ebony Mall. My intention was to evaluate our employees' working conditions and the ethics of our managerial practices. The evidence I've gathered is troubling." Opening a folder she had brought along, Nandi proceeded to distribute documents. These papers detail multiple instances of staff intimidation and wrongful termination, all under Mr. Dube's authority. Furthermore, you'll see financial records that show inconsistencies in the distribution of funds allocated for our community outreach programs. Mr. Dube's cheeks reddened and his jaw tightened. "This is ridiculous," he spat. "I've never seen these documents before. They could be forgeries for all I know." Several board members exchanged skeptical glances. They had worked with Mrs. Lawson for many years and trusted her due diligence. More importantly, they recognized that Nandi, as majority shareholder, had full legal access to the mall's financial records, making forgery an unlikely claim. Mrs. Lawson's expression hardened. "Mr. Dube, please maintain decorum. Miss Nandi's findings are verifiable. Our accountants have examined these records as well. We have reason to believe that you have been using your position to filter money away from intended outreach initiatives, among other serious charges." Nandi nodded and continued, "Beyond the financial irregularities, the moral dimension troubles me even more. A manager who punishes employees for acts of compassion, like assisting an elderly beggar, is not in line with the vision we set for Ebony Mall. We intended this place to be a beacon of modern African prosperity, one that uplifts the surrounding community rather than turning a blind eye to hardship." Dazed by the onslaught, Mr. Dube made an attempt at defiance. "This is a smear campaign," he insisted, casting a desperate look at the board members. "I improved this mall's profitability by leaps and bounds. Is that suddenly worthless because one disgruntled employee made a false report?" "Not just one employee," Nandi corrected. "We've received statements from several individuals corroborating these allegations. Additionally, we have CCTV footage of the incident in which I was dismissed for giving a meal to an elderly beggar at the entrance, a woman you repeatedly had removed. Is that also a fabrication?" At her question, Mr. Dube's facade cracked. Realizing he had few avenues of escape, he sank back into his seat. In the hush that followed, tension buzzed like electricity in the air. Every board member present understood the magnitude of these allegations. If they were proven true, Mr. Dube's position was indefensible. Sensing the weight of the moment, Mrs. Lawson closed the folder of evidence. We've heard enough for now. Mr. Dube, you'll have a chance to formally respond to these charges. However, in light of their severity, and with Miss Nandi's backing, this board will consider immediate suspension of your duties, pending a thorough audit. Until then, Ebony Mall's management will be overseen by an interim executive of our choosing. Nandi watched Mr. Dube's face flicker from disbelief to fury to a kind of sullen resignation. In that moment, she felt a swirl of emotions herself: relief, vindication, and a sadness that it had come to this. She had hoped to find Ebony Mall in better hands, that the manager they had entrusted would have lived up to the mall's ethos. Instead, she had uncovered a glaring contradiction between profit and empathy. Thank you, Miss Nandi, for bringing these matters to our attention, Mrs. Lawson concluded, breaking the silence. We look forward to your guidance as we chart the next steps for Ebony Mall. Rising from her seat, Nandi dipped her head respectfully, taking in the stunned board members, the unsettled Mr. Dube, and the swirl of tension in the room. She knew that outside these walls, Ebony Mall continued its daily commerce, oblivious to the momentous meeting taking place. But once the truth was revealed publicly, everything would change, for her, for the staff, and for Ebony Mall's future as a beacon of ethical, modern African business. In the days following the explosive board meeting, the ripple effects were felt throughout Ebony Mall. Though operations continued for customers relatively smoothly on the surface, behind the scenes, a wave of audits, interviews, and reorganizations was underway. Mr. Dube, now under suspension, was confined to his office to assist accountants and legal investigators in verifying or disproving the financial irregularities. Security footage was reviewed, transaction logs scrutinized, and employees were interviewed in private to uncover any workplace grievances. Word spread fast among the staff. The once untouchable Mr. Dube had been dethroned from his pedestal of absolute authority, and the quiet janitress they had seen scrubbing floors each morning was actually the mall's top stakeholder. Reactions varied. Some were amazed, some felt vindicated, and others were simply grateful that change was in motion. As employees gathered in break rooms or paused in corridors, they whispered about how none of them had suspected Nandi's true identity. Yet the universal sentiment was one of admiration for the modest way she had gone about uncovering the mall's internal shortcomings. Meanwhile, Nandi embraced her new role in the open. Freed from the constraints of her janitorial disguise, she worked from a provisional office near the boardroom, meeting with department heads to reevaluate how each sector was run. In her discussions, she projected the same warmth and compassion that had endeared her to employees when she was cleaning floors. However, she also showed a firm resolve in rectifying the problems she had discovered, stating that Ebony Mall must reflect the best of modern Africa, progress and prosperity rooted in integrity. During one of these hectic days, while Nandi was reviewing marketing proposals from a small group of local vendors hoping to lease space in the mall, a timid knock interrupted her concentration. The door creaked open, and to her surprise, Mama Imani shuffled in, guided by one of the security guards who appeared somewhat embarrassed. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he apologized hastily, "but she insisted on seeing you. She says she knows you." Seeing the elderly beggar who had inadvertently triggered her dismissal, Nandi's eyes welled with compassion. She stood up immediately, beckoning the guard to help seat Mama Imani on a plush visitor's chair. "It's all right," she said. "She's welcome here." The old woman's face lit up with relief. Over her shoulder hung a weather-beaten satchel, and a pair of worn slippers clung to her feet. Though she appeared frilier than ever, there was a radiant gratitude in her eyes. "Child, they told me that you are the owner of this place." "I couldn't believe it," she began in a trembling voice. Nandi knelt beside her, taking Mama Imani's hand gently. "It's true. And I'm sorry I never told you. I wanted to help you then, and I still do now." Tears glistened on the older woman's wrinkled cheeks as she shook her head. "You have already helped me more than you know. Your kindness saved me many days from going hungry. I only came to see how you were doing. Someone said you were fired on my account." Nandi exhaled softly. "That's a misunderstanding I plan to correct. But tell me, how have you been? Are you safe?" A lingering cough rattled through the old woman's chest. "I manage. Another guard told me I could no longer sit near the entrance, so I haven't been around much. But someone pointed me to an organization that provides help for the elderly. I've stayed in one of their shelters for a little while." Nandi looked up at the security guard, who nodded in silent confirmation. She felt a pang of guilt, recalling how Ebony Mall's policies set by Mr. Dube, had driven away people like Mama Imani instead of helping them. Determined to change that narrative, she reached out and clasped the old woman's hands again. "Stay as long as you like. There's much for us to talk about. I'd like to see you get the proper care and comfort you deserve. Maybe we can even find a small kiosk space where you can sell homemade crafts or local snacks, if that interests you." Emotions soared through the tiny office as the elderly woman thanked Nandi repeatedly. Meanwhile, the security guard stepped back, awed by this new atmosphere of compassion and inclusion emanating from the top. In his eyes, Ebony Mall was being reborn into something kinder. Outside Nandi's office, Mr. Dube was making one of his final trips down the corridor, escorted by 2 auditors. He had just finished another grueling interrogation about funds that had gone unaccounted for. His once pristine suit was now crumpled, and an air of resignation hung over him. Spotting the old beggar he once despised sitting comfortably in what used to be his domain, he felt a pang of bitterness welling up inside him. How had things flipped so drastically? Summoning a burst of misplaced arrogance, Mr. Dube approached the office doorway. He waved the auditors away, telling them he needed a moment to speak privately with Nandi. Though reluctant, they relented, lingering close enough to hear raised voices should the meeting turn hostile. As he entered, his gaze flitted from Nandi to the elderly woman and back again. He cleared his throat. "I see you're running your social welfare projects right here in your office now," he said scornfully. Nandi rose calmly, her posture unwavering. "Given the state you left things in, I have to start somewhere." A tense silence stretched between them. Mama Imani, feeling the hostility in the air, began to rise, but Nandi gently urged her to remain seated. Mr. Dube's next words dripped with desperation. "I know you have the board against me, but you can't prove everything you say I've done. I never intended to harm the mall's image, only to maintain it." "By alienating the very community we serve?" Nandi asked, arching an eyebrow. "By siphoning off funds meant for charitable outreach, all to pad your own budget lines? That's not maintaining the mall's image, Mr. Dube. That's exploitation." He scoffed, though his bravado was fading. "All I did was follow through on what the market demands. Ebony Mall thrives on exclusivity and luxury. The wealthy don't want to be bothered by beggars. They don't want to see poverty on their doorstep." The old woman's frail voice, surprising them both, broke in. "You talk about the wealthy as though they are gods on earth. But wealth can fade like the harmattan wind. Compassion is what makes a community strong." Mr. Dube stiffened, his jaw flexing. "Spare me the wisdom, old woman. I've done more to keep this mall profitable than anyone else." Nandi, controlling her rising anger, responded with measured determination. "Profit must never come at the cost of humanity. Don't forget this mall belongs to the people who work here, shop here, and live around it. That's the future I envision, a place that respects both commerce and community." Mr. Dube opened his mouth to retort, but no words emerged. He recognized the unyielding firmness in Nandi's gaze. The truth was painfully clear: he had been found out. Even if he tried to spin a different narrative, the evidence against him was overwhelming. Lowering his head, he muttered a half-hearted apology, less from sincerity and more from an attempt to garner pity. Nandi, sensing his self-preserving motive, remained unmoved. "The auditors will handle what remains, Mr. Dube. I suggest you prepare for the consequences of your actions." She glanced at the doorway, where the auditors and security guards waited, then signaled for them to re-enter. As he was led away, Mr. Dube tossed a final venomous glare at the elderly woman and at Nandi, who stood protectively beside her. But the days of his dominance were gone. The synergy of evidence and the moral high ground had toppled his reign. Once the tension dissipated, Nandi returned her attention to Mama Imani, offering a gentle smile. "I'm sorry you had to see that," she said softly. "But I promise you, Ebony Mall is taking a new direction, one that cares about the people, not just the profits. Touched by Nandi's reassurance, the old woman smiled through her tears. "You've done more for me than my own children ever did. May blessings follow you, my child." Nandi gently squeezed her hand. "Thank you. And I promise we will do more. Our city has enough wealth to take care of everyone, if only we choose to share it." In that small office, a new chapter for Ebony Mall was truly beginning. Staff looking on felt hopeful, sensing that a refreshing breeze of change was blowing away the stale air of fear and exploitation. And for Nandi, this was the moment she had prepared for, a chance to prove that kindness and prosperity could coexist in modern Africa, building something stronger than any purely profit-driven business could ever achieve. In the weeks that followed, Ebony Mall underwent an unprecedented transformation. Armed with her newfound authority, Nandi established an interim management committee composed of department heads, long-standing employees, and representatives from community organizations. She believed that the mall's success hinged on collaborative decision-making and insisted that both profit and community interest be weighed in every strategic plan. Transparency became the watchword. A large bulletin board near the employee entrance displayed updates on new policies, financial allocations, and community outreach endeavors. This visible commitment to openness bolstered staff morale. Those who had once felt voiceless and intimidated under Mr. Dube now found themselves encouraged to voice suggestions or concerns. The once quiet corridors of the employee quarters buzzed with hopeful energy. Mama Imani, too, became an unlikely symbol of the mall's new ethos. At Nandi's invitation, she took up a small space near the entrance, no longer to beg, but to offer small homemade crafts and healthy snacks she had learned to make at the shelter. Her frail body still tired easily, and she needed help setting up each morning, but the dignified smile on her face resonated with customers. Many paused to chat or buy a few of her goods, not out of pity, but in appreciation of her resilience and the personal stories she loved to share. Over time, her little booth became a point of conversation, further humanizing the mall's image in the eyes of the public. Journalists from local stations picked up the story, praising Ebony Mall for championing social responsibility. The audits continued, revealing layers of financial misconduct orchestrated by Mr. Dube. He had manipulated the budget for personal gain, and in some instances, channeled money to external accounts linked to shadowy business associates. Legal proceedings began, culminating in Mr. Dube's formal termination and a civil case accusing him of embezzlement. Though the process was painful and somewhat scandalous for a mall that prided itself on a spotless reputation, Nandi chose to handle it with forthright honesty. She held a press conference to address the situation, her poised demeanor and compassionate vision winning over skeptics. During that conference, she outlined her commitment to ethical leadership, fair labor practices, and innovative community collaboration. Over time, the customer base shifted subtly. While still attracting the affluent clientele who came for high-end fashion boutiques and gourmet restaurants, Ebony Mall also started welcoming a broader demographic drawn to its inclusive environment. Young entrepreneurs from modest backgrounds saw in Nandi's leadership a chance to break into larger markets. A new program was introduced, offering short-term pop-up stalls at reduced rates to up-and-coming local artisans. This program brought vibrant cultural offerings to the mall's rotating exhibits. Intricately carved wooden sculptures, beaded jewelry reflecting ancestral designs, and contemporary African streetwear that caught the eye of fashion-forward visitors. Employees found themselves on stronger footing, too. Maintenance staff were given safer, modern equipment and better working conditions. Their break room, once cramped and rarely cleaned, was renovated to include comfortable seating and fresh air ventilation. Security guards underwent specialized training to de-escalate conflicts and work effectively with the community rather than against it. Even the managerial tier underwent a reshuffle, promoting those who had demonstrated ethical leadership and fair-mindedness. One weekend morning, as the city stirred to life, a ceremonial opening took place within Ebony Mall's largest atrium. A newly installed mosaic, crafted by local artists, depicted the dual forces of progress and compassion. It showed silhouettes of skyscrapers rising against a background of farmland and traditional villages, a reminder that in modern Africa, heritage and innovation could coexist harmoniously. Community leaders, media personnel, and excited families gathered for the unveiling. Nandi stood at the forefront, dressed in a simple yet elegant African print dress, her warm smile reflecting how momentous the occasion was for her personally and for the mall's future. Among the attendees was Mrs. Lawson, the board chair who had facilitated much of the institutional support behind Nandi's reforms. She offered a few words to the crowd, praising Nandi's visionary stance on inclusive growth and expressing optimism that Ebony Mall's new approach would become a model for other businesses across the continent. A round of applause followed, echoing through the lofty spaces of the atrium. After the ceremony, Nandi found herself swarmed by well-wishers, staff who wanted to greet her, and reporters eager for a quote. Despite her new status as a public figure, she was still the same quietly humble person within. She responded patiently to each inquiry, emphasizing that success belonged to the entire Mall family. When reporters asked about her motivations, she spoke candidly, "I was raised to believe that our true wealth lies in caring for each other. In Ebony Mall, we aim to reflect that by valuing compassion as much as commerce." In the crowd, Nandi spotted a familiar face, Binta, one of the janitors she used to work alongside. Binta wore a look of nervous admiration, her eyes darting around as though she wasn't sure if it was appropriate to approach. Catching her friend's gaze, Nandi broke away from the reporters and strode over, offering a warm embrace. "Binta," she exclaimed. "How have you been?" A shy grin brightened Binta's face. "I'm good. Better, I think. Things feel different now. More hopeful. It's kind of strange seeing you like this." Her eyes flicked to Nandi's attire and the crowd of important guests swirling behind her. Nandi laughed gently. "It's strange for me too. But did you get the promotion you wanted? I heard they were looking for a new shift supervisor." A spark of excitement lit Binta's eyes. "I did. I'm starting next week. Thank you for making all these changes happen." A spark of excitement lit Binta's eyes. "I did. I'm starting next week. Thank you for making all these changes happen." "It's a team effort," Nandi replied. "And it's long overdue. If you ever notice something that needs improving, you know my door is always open." Binta nodded vigorously, her face alight with gratitude. In that moment, she saw not just the mall's majority shareholder, but the same compassionate friend she had scrubbed floors with. The two parted ways with a sense that the bond forged by genuine understanding would continue to shape the mall's culture. As midday approached, Nandi sought out Mama Imani, who was at her small kiosk near the mall entrance. A throng of customers admired handcrafted bracelets she had painstakingly beaded, each piece telling a little story of perseverance. Approaching quietly, Nandi watched the old woman share a laugh with a shopper. There was no trace of the worn-out beggar who had once crouched on the pavement, awaiting stray coins. Instead, here was an entrepreneur in her own right, forging new relationships and standing proudly beneath Ebony Mall's lofty ceiling. When the crowd thinned, Nandi stepped forward. "I hope business is good," she teased, eyeing the small stash of coins and bills in a wooden bowl on the table. Mama Imani's sunken cheeks lifted in a smile. "I can hardly believe it sometimes. Just a few months ago, I thought my life was over. I had nothing to my name but tattered clothes. And now look at me, part of this grand place." Nandi squeezed her hand gently. "I'm so happy for you. And I promise, as we continue to expand, we'll find more ways to include people in need, to give them a second chance just like you've had." The old woman's eyes glimmered with tears of joy. "Bless you, my child," she whispered. "May Ebony Mall shine across Africa as a beacon of what can be accomplished when we honor our common humanity." Stepping back, Nandi surveyed the busy corridor. Families strolled by, sipping fruit juice or nibbling on sweet puff-puff. Young lovers held hands as they window shopped for trendy outfits. Business executives breezed through on their lunch breaks, drawn not only by the mall's high-end offerings but also by its vibrant sense of community. The hum of contented activity filled the space, a living testament that prosperity could indeed flourish alongside compassion. In that moment, Nandi's thoughts drifted to the future, how Ebony Mall could evolve, how it might inspire other enterprises across the city, across the nation, and perhaps even across the continent. She vowed to never lose sight of the lessons she learned while scrubbing those floors: humility, empathy, and a willingness to see beyond appearances. Her experiences had reshaped not only the fate of a mall, but also her own understanding of leadership in a modern African context. A silent promise pulsed through her veins: may we always find the courage to do what's right, no matter the cost. For Nandi, the janitress-turned-owner, Ebony Mall stood as a testament to that promise. A resplendent edifice that housed not merely stores and restaurants, but dreams, second chances, and a spirit of unity that transcended wealth or social status. In its polished corridors, a new dawn had truly broken, illuminating a path where kindness and ambition walked hand in hand, forging a brighter future for everyone who entered its doors. The end. If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing heartwarming stories almost every day. We are very grateful for your support. See you soon.